Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay. We're here in Studio Road at the Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from Children's.
And we're having another conversation, this one about Irish mythology. This is part 2. We already had part 1 last week.
We did.
Yes. So as you recall, in our last exciting chapter, we had the Tuatha de Dannan arriving in ancient Ireland.
Yes.
So this will cover the arrival of the Fomorians, their arch enemies, and the second battle of Maighe Tuired.
Okay.
Now you may wonder, what was the first battle of Maighe Tuired?
I would wonder.
Yes, I'm glad you asked that question. The first battle of Maighe Tuired was the battle where the Tuatha de Dannan defeated the Firbolg, the bagmen, who had lived in Ireland before them.
Okay.
And it was a ferocious battle. The most significant thing to come out of the battle, apart from the Tuatha triumphing, was the fact that their great king Nuana lost his hand in the fight. It was chopped off.
Okay.
Now, they have a rule amongst the Tuatha that you have to be physically perfect to be king. And he had to step down after he lost his hand or his arm, depending on the version of the story you hear. So they didn't have a king, although they controlled Ireland now. The Firbolg were defeated.
Was this done strategically, so he'd be forced out?
It happened. The Firbolg attacked him. It was one of their generals that cut off his arm.
Okay.
So it probably just happened in the course of the battle.
Okay.
But this left them leaderless. Now the Fomorians are their arch enemies.
Leaderless. There was no one primed to take his place?
Yes, I mean they had someone take over,
Okay.
but that's a whole other story. What happened was, the Fomorians are their arch enemies, and they're constantly described as being monstrous and hideous. They're described as constantly having fur and horns and claws and things like that. The word Fomorian means from the sea, meaning they're probably invaders that arrived from another place by boat.
Okay.
Either that or they were like gill creatures with tentacles and crab claws and things like that. No one actually knows. Now the funny part about the Fomorians is they were all hideously ugly, except the ones that were absolutely gorgeous. Yeah.
Male and female?
Male and female, actually. In many races, like with the giants that the Norse would fight, the men were all huge and ugly, and the women are all very attractive.
Huh.
And oddly, the women were never so tall that Thor couldn't fall for one of them. Go figure. So the Fomorians, some of them were very attractive. Now, they had sent a scout party ahead before they arrived in full force. And their king arrived to scout out Ireland and ran into a Tuatha woman and seduced her, and in fact got her with child. She gave birth to a child who was clearly magical because he grew up really, really quickly. Like within a couple of days, he was a teenager and then an adult.
Wow.
Yeah. He was called Bress. He was basically a golden child. Everybody who saw him loved him. He was beautiful, he was talented, he could do everything well. And when they had no leader, the Tuatha turned to Bress to lead them, and he became their king. So, basically, Bress becomes king, and the Fomorians start arriving in force on the island.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's trouble immediately. There was battle, there was combat, there was strife, and as the newly crowned king, Bress was bringing an end to all that by signing a treaty with the Fomorians.
Mm-hmm.
However, the treaty for the Tuatha didn't turn out exactly the way they wanted. Bress wound up tilting things in favor of the Fomorians. And the Tuatha found they had to pay off like war reparations and things like that. And they had to serve the Fomorians, build castles for them, dig ditches for them, and things like that. Basically forced to do menial labor, which as Celtic gods they thought was, a little bit beneath them. Now, again, there's different versions of all of these stories. In some versions of the story, no one knew that Bress was actually half Fomorian. In some versions, they know he's half Fomorian, and he's deliberately made the king because he can bridge the gap between the two peoples.
Okay.
This kind of makes sense, because it's pretty obvious which people that he favors. So, meanwhile, Nuana, who's still missing a hand, or at least an arm, yes.
Did he favor them because he attributed his powers to that side, that half of him?
Probably. The stories don't really don't give him any dialogues. We really don't know what his motives are.
Huh.
But Nuana had a hand made of silver to replace his regular one,
Mm-hmm.
which was very cool. However, that was still not good enough.
Imperfect.
Right, so eventually the god of healing managed to replace his silver hand with an actual, real, functioning hand.
Oh.
Very useful. And once he was whole again, he came back and he threw out Bress and took over.
From back. Okay.
But by this time, it was obvious that the Fomorians were going to be trouble until something was done about it. In fact, Bress went back and became leader of the Fomorians. And while he wasn't a very good leader of the Tuatha, he was a pretty good leader of the Fomorians. So it was obvious it was all going to come to a head soon in a really huge war. So the Tuatha de Dannan have ousted their king. They have their good king back, Nuana. They're living in Tara, their big giant like mead hall place. And this is the part of the story where heroes from all over Ireland gather, and they all have stories attached to them. I'll only do one of the stories, which is the best one, which is Lug. One night there's a pounding on the door to Tara, and the gatekeeper opens it up, and there's a guy out there who demands entrance, and he wants to join the company. And they say, well, there's no room. We're filled up right now. We have all the warriors that we need. And he says, but you have a warrior who can cast a stone from a sling and kill a dozen men. He says, yeah, we do actually. He's right over there, with the jar of mead in his hand. And he says, well, do you have a bricklayer who can lay a brick wall that is as straight as an arrow and will never fall down? He says, yeah, we have a mason right over there. And he says, well, do you have a healer who can heal any ailments? Yeah, god of healing. Yeah, he's right there. Do you have a blacksmith? Yeah, the goddess of smithing, she's here, And so this goes on and on, because it's an Irish story. So it goes on for quite a while. And then finally, at the end, the guy says, but do you have one person who can do all of those things? And he goes, hold on a moment. He goes running back to Nuana and gives him the whole rigmarole. And so naturally, Nuana invites him in to join the company. And he was Lug the long-armed. He's a ferocious warrior, skilled at pretty much everything that they expected a Celtic warrior to be skilled at. He was just the best at everything. So they're starting to feel pretty good about themselves at this point, but they're going up against, the Fomorians, who are fierce opponents, whom they've never actually managed to beat in battle. It's always been a stalemate or they've lost. So during this time period before the big battle starts, a lot of things happen. And the Dagda comes back into the picture. He's the big, burly, bearded guy. This is when he really shines. The first thing he does is lay with the Morrigan, the goddess of death and fate and destruction and so forth. Why he did this is the subject of many storytellers pondering. There's a version of the story in which he lays with the Morrigan to make sure that she favors their side in the coming war. Most people assume that actually that shouldn't be true, because although the Morrigan may have her own agenda, she's actually never betrayed her own people. So she was probably already on their side. There's a version of the story in which, after laying with her, he asks her to go to Indench, the Fomorian general, and take him out of the picture to give him a better deal. And she flies away, and she comes back with Indench's heart in one hand and his liver in the other. Pretty impressive stuff. Their coupling was so mighty that it left a deep furrow in the ground that remains there to this day, they say. So there you go, Dagda. But that wasn't all he did. Oh no, he did much more than that. He was always willing to take one for the team.
I'd imagine.
Yeah. So Nuana wants to find out the Fomorians' strength and so forth. So he sends Dagda in there to parley with them. And Dagda gets there, and it's quite obvious that the Fomorians are not going to take any kind of conversation seriously. He comes in, and they offer him to feed him, because you have to feed a guest by the rules of good conduct. And so they dig a huge giant trench in the ground and fill it up with porridge. And it's really thick porridge with lots of oats, and there's a huge amount of it, 4 gallon of milk went into it and so forth. And they throw in entire pigs and goats to provide meat for the porridge and so forth. And they give him a giant ladle so huge that 2 people could lay in it. And they say, of course, if you don't finish all this, that'll be a dire insult to us. We'll have no choice but to kill you. And so Dagda immediately grabs a gigantic ladle and digs into this and starts shoveling it down. And he eventually succeeds in draining every last drop of it.
Uh-huh.
And in some versions, they then offer him, they pour all the wine that they have in the place into one gigantic container and shove that at him. He says, and you must drink all of it, or we will have no choice but to kill you. So it actually, he downs the whole thing. So by this point, he's really had enough of these guys. So he leaves. But he's in bad shape at this point. They say his belly is vastly extended, swollen so much that his clothes don't even fit him anymore. So he's kind of staggering along, dragging his great war club behind him. and suddenly an extremely attractive woman comes in front of him. She's in fact the daughter of Indench. So in some version of the story, she's the daughter of the guy that the Dagda had killed. Although that's not true in every version of the story. And so he's very attracted to her, but he can't act on those impulses because he's in really rough shape right now. He's eaten all the Thanksgiving dinners in the world and can barely move. And so she satirizes him. Now, to be satirized in those days was a horrible, horrible thing. Being satirized just like can ruin a person's entire life. That's how powerful their bards were in Ireland. And he's such a pathetic figure, she satirizes him 3 times until he finally cries out, "Do not make fun of me anymore." And she says, "I will try to stop it, it will not be easy." There's a version of the story in which she beats him with a stick at this point. There's a version in which she wrestles him to the ground. But whatever she does, he eventually loses everything in his stomach and creates a huge mess. And he's even worse shape than he was before. But she's not done with him yet. She asked that she should mount him and ride on his back, and he should carry her. And because it turns out, remember all great Celtic heroes have a geas? Now his geas is he must carry someone on his back who's asked him to by using his true name. Now obviously Dagda isn't his true name. So this part of the story becomes one of those like guessing riddle games, like Rumpelstiltskin. And what she says, "Tell me your name," and he says, "Well, I am such and such." And he says, "Take me on your back, such and such." She says, "That is not my name." And he laughs and goes on another few steps, and she jumps in front of him and demands to know his name again. And again, he tells her something that's not his real name. This goes on and on until at some point she wears him down, and he finally gives his real name. And then she climbs on his back and hits him with a stick, and he carries her away. So naturally, she became his mistress after that, because what else are you going to do with a woman like that? And when they eventually were able to hook up with each other, she agreed to be loyal to the Tuatha de Dannan, and that she would cast spells against her own people in battle. So she turned out to be a very useful ally, even though, as I said, in some version of the story, the Dagda had her father killed. Maybe it didn't bother her that much. Yeah, who knows? The Fomorians.
Maybe there was good reason.
Yeah. Again, these stories, although I've read like 5 different versions in the last like couple of weeks, there's just enough differences to leave a lot of room for doubt about anyone's real motivations in these stories, because they're stories of gods. And because they're Irish stories and most of them go on and on. There's someone who does a YouTube on the same storyline that goes on for an hour and a half.
Wow.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. If I gave all the details, we'd be there that long.
So does that appear in any of these books?
Only in abbreviated form, actually.
Which?
I think this one, I believe, has it in there. Look up Fomorians in the back. It'll go through the whole battle.
Is it F or PH?
It is F, F-O-R-M-I-A-N-S, I believe. But it's translated from, Gaelic, so who knows? So anyway, the big battle is coming up. Everybody's girding their loins and getting together, and the Irish warriors have a big meeting in which they discuss what each of them will do in battle, and they call out, what shall you do in battle? And some such and such warrior says, I will slay like 20 men every time I swing my sword. And the god of Smiths says, I will turn out fresh swords for each one that is broken on the battlefield and toss it to the warriors, and so forth and so on. And the ones that are wounded will be brought back and put in Dagda's cauldron to be instantly healed and brought back to life again to go back into the battle. And this also goes on and on for page after page. So every Irish warrior of the time gets a name drop in this sequence. So the day comes, huge fight, everybody's combating, gigantic battle, it goes back and forth, and the Fomorians eventually bring out their big gun. Now, even though some of them were incredibly attractive, like the daughter of Indench, but many of them were monstrous. And the most monstrous person among the Fomori was Baelor, a Baelor of the Evil Eye. He's still a monster in D&D monster manuals to this very day. He basically had a single eye in his forehead like a cyclops, but the eye would either strike people dead if you saw it, or it was a burning eye like the eye of Sauron, who would just cut through you like a laser beam. Either way, Balor was bad news. And when he came onto the battlefield, things immediately turned in the Fomorians' favor. Now, as the battle had started, the Tuatha de Dannan was so worried about Lug, the long-armed, because they knew he would rush into battle immediately to the front lines and probably immediately be killed. They surrounded him with 9 warriors whose job it was to, take all the arrows that were heading towards Lug to keep him safe. Mm-hmm. But after the fight goes on, Lug can't take this anymore. So he bursts free from the people who were guarding him, fights his way through until Balor is like towering over the battlefield, just like killing people right and left. Mm-hmm. And he's doing it without his eye. He's just like crushing them in his massive fists. Because Lug comes up and challenges him to a fight. And so Balor, calls out, "Lift up my eyelid." And so these smaller Fomorians scramble across him and grab his eyelid and actually forcibly lift it up. And just as the death beam was coming out towards him, Lug loaded a stone into his sling and hurled it through the air and shot it right into the eye socket, blinding him and rendering him powerless. And then he ran him through with his magic sword.
All right, then.
And without Balor, the Fomorians folded pretty quickly. That was their ace in the hole. With him dead, the Tuatha de Dannan were victorious once again. And they're able to save Ireland and live there on and on.
Xena, the warrior princess,
Mm-hmm.
is that Greek or is that actually from this?
She's Greek.
Okay.
Yeah, she's tied very heavily to Greek mythology. She may have gone to Ireland. I haven't seen that series in a long time.
It has been a long time.
Yeah, she went to India, I know. She went to the Northlands and fought Valkyries, actually became a Valkyrie. She might have had a thing where she teamed up with Cuchulainn. I'm not sure.
Wow.
I'll have to watch that whole series again now. So the Fomorians were defeated, and the Tuatha de Dannan ruled Ireland again. But the story of Ireland is called the Book of Invasions for a reason. Because only a few hundred years later that new people arrived, the Milesians. And they're the ancestors of the current Irish people today. They arrived by boat from across the sea, and they were able to take over the island. And the Tuatha de Dannan eventually succumbed to them. And they supposedly brought Christianity with them, although probably the Celtic gods were probably vanished long before Christianity actually arrived in Ireland. But when the stories are told today, the last wave of invaders had Christians with them, monks and things like that, whose power that the Tuatha couldn't face up against, supposedly. And that was when the Tuatha de Dannan began to dwindle and shrink, and they became the Sidhe, the Fey folk who live in the mounds underground.
So literally, physically.
Supposedly. According to one of the stories, the little fairies that are running around Ireland today are the tiny diminutive ancestors of the mighty Tuatha de Dannan who strode across the land like giants.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's tough.
Yeah. Well, Celtic mythology for you, I like the stories of the Irish mythology because they're very earthy, they're very full of weird, like rich details. And the thing about the Dagda's numerous seductions, when he lays with the Morrigan, in 3 of the versions that I read of that story, they said the Morrigan had her hair in 9 tresses. It's like 9 braids, maybe. But the Celtic people must have thought that was really hot, because the storytellers make a point of mentioning that her hair was in 9 tresses, like twice. And when the daughter of Indinch appears, her hair is also in tresses. Maybe it's just Dagda that went for that. I don't know. He was definitely into hair and tresses on beautiful women. But yeah, the Irish stories, I highly recommend them. They're full of, like I said, they're full of weird little details and things like that. And because storytelling is a real art in Ireland to this day, the stories are long. They go on and on, full of all kinds of interesting characters. I haven't even gotten into Finn McCool and that whole cycle of stories. But that is the story of the Tuatha de Dannan, the coming of the Fomorians, and the second battle of Maighe Tuired.
What's your favorite way to experience the story?
I don't know. Reading them is really good. They're meant to be done as spoken word pieces, but most of the things I'm finding online, like on YouTube, aren't done by storytellers. They're done by academics, and some of them are really good and really informative, but they lose that quality of coming from the mouth of a storyteller. When you read the actual texts and they're available at several places online. They get a rhythm of what's going on. Sadly, at the end of the battle against the Fomorians, they throw a big party, and the Morrigan shows up, and she congratulates them on their battle and predicts that there will be, good times ahead for them. And then weirdly, she gives a second prophecy that one day their doom will come, and all their cattle will dry up, and the grass will become brown, and things like that. And her words are almost the exact parallel to the prophecy of Ragnarok that Odin would hear from a somewhat different culture.
Okay.
But the annoying thing about the story is it cuts off in the middle of a sentence. It's a fragmentary story, and that piece of parchment or whatever it was written on was broken off at that point. So we don't know what else the Morrigan had to say, and we never will.
So I think last week there was an element of mystery, so there we go.
Yeah,
Back to
exactly.
mystery.
The Tuatha de Dannan, like the Fae, are creatures of mystery and myth, creatures of illusion. And that's all we have time for today.
Ah.
I know, it goes so fast. We'll talk about more exciting stuff from the world of mythology next week. Until then, I have been Ed.
Solitaire.
And we'll see you next time. Until then, be safe.